Okay. Hello, everybody. How are we doing today? Excellent. Thank you all for being here. My name is Seth. I work for the Center for Wellbeing. I work particularly in the Office of Health Promotion, Resilience, and Violence Prevention. And so glad to see you all here today, both in person and on Zoom. As you can see, we're here for the panel. It's part of our Man Enough series. We've got some more events coming up before the end of the school year, so we'll talk about those at the end and make sure you're all plugged into that. Want to let all the students know that if you need to get your event pass scanned, you probably heard this as you came in, we're going to be scanning those afterwards. So there's a table outside with a tablecloth on it and a bunch of like free pens and stuff. And awesome Band-Aids. Definitely get yourself a free Band-Aid. That's where you can go afterwards, and we'll have people there who will scan your event passes before you leave, okay? Yes, and don't forget to grab a cookie on your way to get your event pass scanned, because we will have cookies for everybody afterwards, which was next on my list, so thank you. And then I just want to let you guys know, today we're going to be talking about healthy masculinity, the ways that we learn, right? What is it? What are the pressures put on us to act man enough? The pressures put on other people. And I think, sometimes with those kind of topics, we get into conversations around relationships, domestic violence, sexual violence. So I don't know the level that we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of that today, but just wanted you to be aware that that's a possible topic of conversation. Definitely do what you need to do to take care of yourself. You need to step out of the room, grab a drink of water, whatever. Make that a priority. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn the PowerPoint off so we can focus on our awesome panelists. By the way, did you guys know that if you press the letter B on a keyboard during a PowerPoint, it turns it black? I learned that today, and it's great to know. Yeah. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we're going to get into it. So in order of how they're sitting, Marlon Blake currently serves as Assistant Dean of Students here at University of St. Thomas. In his role, he oversees the CARE team, which has responsibilities in working with students who are having a challenging time at our university. Marlon also serves as the Parent and Family Liaison in the Dean of Students office. Marlon has spent the last 12 years working in various areas of higher education. So please welcome Marlon to the panel. We also have Dr. Paula Ehrmantraut. Dr. Paula Ehrmantraut directs Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and is an executive member of the American Men's Studies Association. Her research area is in masculinities in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, and how gender constructions support strong democracies in these post-dictatorship societies. Dr. Ehrmantraut will teach WGSS 297, Making and Unmaking, next semester, so look out for that. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Ehrmantraut. Yeah. And Vern Klobasa is the Director of Student Development and Co-Director of First Year Experience at St. Thomas. He is the past chair of the ACPA, College Student Educators International Coalition on Men and Masculinities, a group that promotes college men's development from a feminist and social justice standpoint. Vern teaches in the Leadership and Student Affairs program and the Women's Studies program at University of St. Thomas. Thanks for being here, Vern. One other thing I'll just say before we get into this. All of you got an index card on your way in, hopefully, and a pen. As we're talking, as things come up, as you have questions, feel free to just write a question on there. You can write 2 or 3 questions if you want. And then once I'm done with all my questions, we're going to have one of our student workers come and collect all those index cards and bring them up to me. That way, if anyone doesn't want to ask their question on a microphone, you can just write it down and I'll read it off for you. And if you're on the Zoom, you can also type your question into the Q&A, and we'll have people monitoring that who will then write it on note cards and bring it up here. All right? So just, keep keep your brain cells moving. See if you come up with any questions as we have this conversation. Okay, so we're gonna go in reverse order of what I just did. So starting with you, Vern. Would you care to tell us about a time, an experience, a story that you have where masculinity or expectations of masculinity impacted your life?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Can folks hear me all right? Is this on? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
They're all
Testing,
they are.
testing, testing.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, let's go.
Do you remember those old commercials? We don't have those anymore, do we? Yeah, that's right. Well, I appreciate the question, Seth. And one, thank you all for being here. Was really excited about this conversation because it's an important conversation. As I was reflecting on this question, and thank you for sending the questions ahead of time because it's nice to have a little time to reflect. There were a lot of stories that came to mind. Not seeking help when I need it, including counseling, right? Not feeling like I can be my authentic self and expressing my true emotions. We literally were just talking about that like a minute ago, and that story will probably come up. Things that I've done mostly in my younger years that were degrading to the dignity of other people. I'm not proud of that, but that was part of my experience. But the story that I want to lead with is one that sticks in my mind because it reminds me how early our socialization around gender starts. So I was at my sister's house. She lives down in Rochester. She's a little over a year older than I am, has 2 kids, and she had some friends over, and these friends had a little 1-year-old. And he was just learning to walk. And he was really shy. There are a bunch of strangers around. There's mom and dad, but everyone else in the space was new to him. So we were sitting around, shooting the breeze, catching up. And this little one would kind of venture a couple of steps away from mom and dad and kind of see that he doesn't know people, then scoot on back, and did that a couple of times. And that all of a sudden became the topic of conversation. Oh, he's a little shy. And dad paused and kind of said, yeah, sometimes I just think he needs to grow a pair. And I mean, that was really jarring for me because I'm sitting here thinking like, well, this little kid's just a 1-year-old, right? And we get into the whole response and everything, like, but the reason that story sticks in my mind, and why I wanted to share it today is because it was one of many constant reminders that I have about how we socialize around gender and around masculinities and how early that socialization starts. I would argue before a child comes out of the womb, that starts, right? And so that was the story that I was sticking in my mind that I thought I'd share.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Vern. Couple quick follow-ups.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Looking back on that, I don't know what you said in the moment, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think would be a good way to respond, or thinking back, like, what would you try to say in that?
Yeah, that's a fair question. It was a long time ago, and I don't remember. I know that I said something along the lines of, "Well, he's just a 1-year-old. It's not surprising, and we're all new to him. It's not surprising that he would be shy. That seems like a really natural reaction." So that was sort of trying to disrupt, and there are probably a lot of other things I probably could have said. We probably could have had an even more critical discussion about gender, and that's not where I chose to go in that moment. But certainly a direction you could go, and
Yeah, I mean,
that I might go today rather than 10 years ago. when this
Exactly.
happened.
Yeah. I mean, it's always hard to know in the moment, and I feel like it's one of those things where you get home that night and you think of 12 things that you
Yeah.
wish you would have said, you know. And that's one of the reasons why I like to be able to organize events like this, is because then you like, okay, next time there's something going on, I'm going to invite that person to that event and be able to bring them into that conversation and
Right.
maybe think a little bit more critically about what they're talking about. Okay, Dr. Ehrmantraut, how about you?
Doubt, pretty, it's, I think that what makes it also heartbreaking is that we have seen this as a mom in the playground. When my kid was younger, we could see these like all the time, the gender expectations placing kids way too early. So this brings it. Um, in my case, the question, so I'm from Argentina, right? And I was born in 1976. And 1976 is a terrible year for my country. It's the year that started the dictatorship, the last military dictatorship we had. And in that dictatorship, there were a lot of messages that had to do with gender. This was a very violent time for my country. A lot of people suffered all kinds of violence. If they were perceived to be in opposition or were in opposition of the government. And in that perception is when also gender played a part, and masculinities in particular. In high school, in the year 1977, you could find a poster that was titled, and a lot of people in my country remember this, not me because I was a baby back then, but a lot of people do. The poster read, "Así sí, así no." This way, yes. This way, no. And there were like a drawing of a couple of teenagers, a man and a woman, a young couple. And they were dressed in a certain way, wearing their hair in a certain way, así sí, right? And así no. And this was produced by the dictatorship and displayed in all high schools, public schools. And it was interesting what the image of the Assisi man, right, the young man of the dictatorship, was really like capturing an image. So teenagers would see this like aspirational. It would be like the picture of someone kind of like college age. So they would show it to you in high school. So you would say, okay, I'll grow into that. And the man in that picture had short hair, tie, tucked in shirt, straight pants, shoes. And the asino, right, had longer hair, flowy clothes, a little facial hair, kind of fancy shoes. And it was an interesting play there on traditional masculinity and how we should perceive it and read it. And what it was outside the asino, right? We all know that there was an implicit threat into that poster, right? So if you're not conforming to this image of masculinity, of this person, of this man, así sí, then así no, right? And that was a target, was a person that was a target probably of violence, just because of the way they chose to wear their hair. Beard was a no-no, no way, yes. The Fidel Castro thing, leftist thing, so no way, and the flowy hair was another thing. So I think that when we think about masculinity and the expectations of masculinity, they can also be deployed in political context and be used to basically normalize or attempt to normalize violence. And I think that is very important, and it's a great lesson that I always keep in mind, because I think we receive all the time images that say así sí, así no, when it comes to gender and when it comes to masculinities, a lot.
So what do you think, you talked a lot about the message being sent. How do you think that message was received by people? Were there people who were rebelling against that, people who were internalizing that, some of each, other things?
A whole range of attitudes to that. Some people would be rebelling against it. Some people will be resisting the dictatorship in many ways. Um, but I think that the violence of that implicit threat is what has stayed with us, because even a person like me that didn't go to high school during that time, I hear about it and I know what they are saying. I still know about this poster, so it has really become part of the collective memory of the time. That idea of men look like this, women look like this, or not, and then you face the consequences. You're not part of this project we have, which is to, rebuild our nation. Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes me think of like the time and place maybe has changed or is different than where we are now. But there's still all sorts of ways that, depending on how you present your gender, what kind of clothes you wear, what kind of hair you have, like determines how safe you might be
Absolutely.
in a particular space. So, over to you, Marlon.
Thank you. We're ready. No, so I'm gonna go a different route since Vern went early age because that was just I think a similar thing to Vern. I was like, man, I got a lot of stories I think I could tell. Um and we all do in a lot of ways. But so I would say probably one of the more like um this was my senior year no, almost my senior year of college. It was like 2009. And I think growing up, I grew up in Mississippi, and so that's part of who I am, and so it shaped a lot about my experience. And so I think like many boys who were raised in this country in particular, like they're the message about like, cry, you're strong, like just push through kind of thing. So long story short, uh my brother had a stroke my freshman year of college. He dies at the end of my college experience. And I remember going to the funeral and I'm in there like, yeah, like we don't cry at funerals, like these kind of scripts you get from other people, like you're not supposed to be emotional. I mean, like this is my brother, but but like I was like all cool and stuff. And we go to the funeral, we go to the burial, and they're putting him in the ground, and I'm like, yeah, I'm still strong. And I see my other brothers who are like going to the casket and like, oh, like saying their goodbyes, and I'm like, we don't do that, like this real strong thing. And so I would say the impact of that though was how much guilt I had after the fact, like for years about like, oh, why didn't I say goodbye? Why was I, the more and more I learned about that experience, right? And so I won't get into this much now, but I think there's a cost when we perform in certain ways. And that cost could be guilt. Sometimes it could unfortunately be some people's lives. It could be friendships, relationships, a lot of things. But there's a cost to all of it. And that was a cost I paid for, I think, a lot of years of my life until I like really processed about what that means. But I do think those scripts and those things we're told to be strong, not emotional. I mean, it showed up in my like now I think about it, I'm like, bro, you're a fool. Like I really like. I mean, that's now, but I mean then I was still in college and I was I thought I had learned some things, but I was still developmentally like processing a lot. But I think about that experience a lot and about how that really shaped how I like move forward and process in other situations. Like my dad died a year ago. I booed the whole time. I was in the airport crying. Like I was on a plane crying. And I mean, it is what it is. But I think I didn't pay the cost as much this time as I did with my oldest brother when he passed away.
So, Marlon, what do you think? How you touched on a little bit of like you did some reflecting and kind of changed that. So, how do you think you moved from how you reacted to your older brother's death and the sense of okay, I have to be strong, I can't cry, I can't show emotion? What changed? What allowed you to make that transition to being more comfortable or more able to actually grieve and to avoid that guilt of, oh, I didn't even get to really say goodbye.
Well, well, I think part of it was what you said. I think for me, I realized that it was just a distraction. That like all those like being strong, not emotional, was like a distraction to not cope with my brother actually being dead. And so it took a lot of years to like really be like, oh dang, why was I acting that way? Like, what was that really about? And so for me, it was more about the reaction or the actions that I had was more about distracting myself from the actual reality that exists because I carried my own guilt. I didn't. I, I could go into a long story about this, but like my brother was so excited when I went to college. I mean, he was even more excited than I was, right? And he was like, "Oh, you should call me," and I'm like, "Yeah." Our freshman year was every week. Oh, I'm gonna call him next week. I'm gonna call him next week. There was so much guilt that of all these things of that experience I had with my brother, and all of it culminated to just this big distraction. And so I use that as a distraction, not to kind of cope with the reality. So
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all three of you sharing some story from your own experiences, and also thank you, Marlon, especially for kind of leaning into a little bit of vulnerability too, because I think that's part of the reason why we're here. Part of the struggles that men often have, and the part of the social pressure that we're not supposed to be vulnerable and talk about topics that are uncomfortable or anything like that. So I appreciate you getting the ball rolling with that. Um, why are we here, do you think? Why is it important to have a panel
self
about?
ask us to be
That's
here.
true. All three of you are here because I asked you to. Um, why do you think it's important to have a panel about masculinity, about the pressures to be man enough? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I'll go. I got a microphone. I'll go. No, I think I think these are much needed conversations, and I think they are the conversations that we should be having in a lot of areas of our lives, not just in the kind of university context. Like Vern and I were talking like before this started, and like you know, for me, I think about when I have a child and that child does something that's out of the norm of their gender, then what do I do? Right? I see it with my nieces and nephews, right? I have to check myself all the time to be like, don't say that. So I think for me, these conversations are important because they're not just about now. They're about what it means in the future. And it also means what happens when you become a leader in your organization or you become a leader wherever it is. And you encounter someone who shows up very differently than what you show up, then what do you do? Right? And so I think it's just this topic is one of many topics I think we all need to be reflective about. Wherever you stand on it, I think you just need to be clear about what you cool with and what you're not. Because I think it allows us to be able to move through this world in like more clear ways for us and for other people. Right. And so I think for me, this conversation is outside of just this university context. I think it is a larger conversation. And I think, unfortunately, masculinity dominates a lot of how we function in our society. And I think we need to question some of those things when it comes to that, and it's just a part of our everyday life, right? About, even the adage where people are like, oh, I'm going to shoot you an email. You going to shoot me an email? Okay. I mean, you can send me one. That's cool. I don't need to you shooting nothing, right? But that shooting, the violence, that like those pieces show up all the time in our lives, right? And I think those are the things we have to start to really question and debunk about how it shows up everywhere, because there's a cost to that. And so I think these conversations are needed for us to be very reflective and clear about who we are and what this means for us as a large society.
Why are we here? Um, this is my topic of research, so for me, I'm always here in this mental space, right? I think that it's very important because it gives us a chance to change the story, right? We can start new conversations. We can question the scripts that are being given to us, um, because all of that is liberating. Because it allows us to think about how we contribute to the reproduction of this construction, and it makes us think, as we are just sharing here with our colleagues. It makes us think there is a cost, right? There is a cost to certain constructions of masculinity. What is that cost? And you really need to think about that, as a man, as a woman, as any other identity. I think that is very important to see what is the cost of this dominant construction of masculinity. How much affection you've been deprived of on that moment of of need, or burn, immediately how many times I needed help and I didn't reach out for help. I think there is a huge loss in that, for men. And for a lot of other, and men too, receive an immense amount of violence, because that is, right, one of the objectives of all this exploration is to analyze and to try to deactivate the violence that this construction also generates. And the numbers, you can Google any number and you can see what we're talking about is absolutely shocking, in a developed country, in a democracy, to see these levels of violence. And men have a lot of exploration to do. Yeah. Hmm. Thanks.
All of that. Yeah, I think, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the concept of healthy masculinity, but to talk a little bit about the way that we currently, like our society, that we currently construct and socialize around masculinity. I think we're here today because if we're going to have a conversation about healthy masculinity, we need to be able to unpack these scripts that we've been talking about, right? Things like boys will be boys, or the proverbial oh, that's just locker room talk, the scripts that men can handle their own problems and don't need help, the the tropes that men are providers and protectors. Like we could collectively in here, we could generate a list a mile long about what these scripts entail. And I think we need to unpack that. To your point, we need to look at how can we construct a new narrative. The other thing that I plan to bring this up a little later too, but just to drop a little, like Judith Butler, who's a gender scholar, and if you haven't read Judith Butler's work, I would encourage you to read Judith Butler's work. But highlights the performative nature of gender, that gender is performed, it's expressed. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is we get to you were kind of talking about being mindful about these scripts and narratives. We make choices every day. I chose to show up in everything that I'm showing up in today, and that is an expression of gender. If we believe gender really exists, we can have that conversation a little bit later too. What I would argue then too is what we put out there is part of our collective socialization, right? And so the choices that we make can also influence our community too. I was sharing a little story, maybe I'll drop this now. I was sharing a story. It was at a conference, and I was on my way home on the flight, and I'm plugged in watching a movie. It was A Man Called Otto. I don't know if anyone's seen that movie. It's really good. I enjoyed it, and it hit a point where I'm crying. It moved me so much. I'm crying, and I'm saying, I've spent a lot of time thinking about these scripts. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on gender, and then I'm still having this reaction like, well, I shouldn't be crying in public. But wait a second. So instead of pushing it down, I let it flow. I tried not to get it on my N95 mask because I didn't want to like degrade the integrity of it, right? But and I think when I think about that, like that's such a small expression, but what can putting that expression out in the world do to invite a different way to understand our masculinities, right? So even those small things can sometimes have an impact on our community. And if we collectively start rewriting these scripts, I think we can start to change the narrative.
Yeah, so it goes to show that even when you're somebody like Vern, who's been talking about reading, being critical about how we learn masculinity, it's so deeply ingrained. It's like
Right.
swimming upstream, right? You know that, oh, I should feel okay, or it is okay for me to cry on an airplane, but then you still have that moment. But like you said, what does that teach the other people on the plane who maybe see you, right? What kind of ripple effects could that have? So I want to touch on something that's a follow-up to a little bit of what both of you two said. And you mentioned kind of and Marlon, you also talked about the large like impact, negative impact of these ideas of traditional or restrictive masculinity, right? The things we miss out on, the guilt that we might have. How do you balance that with understanding, right, that male privilege is also very much real, that there's a lot of things that, you know, some of us as men or masculine presenting people don't have to worry about, right? When it comes to safety, when it comes to violence, relationship violence, right? Walking home, when it comes to financial privilege, right? We could go on and on. And so what would you say to somebody who says, yeah, I get it, like men can't cry in public, but that's a small price to pay for being safe walking home at night, or not have to worry about, you know, experiencing an abusive relationship from a partner, right? Obviously those things like still happen to men, but
Or getting paid more for the same job.
exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you balance that conversation? And I don't know who wants to start, but go ahead, Dr. Amatrell.
This is a tough one. This is a tough one. Is this healthy masculinity an oxymoron, kind of, or?
Yeah, been to that as well. It's all connected.
Because I think that there are two, and this is what in my classes I've termed like the white T-shirt or blue jeans kind of conversation. Masculinity is like that item we all have in our closet, right? We all have a white T-shirt somewhere. Some of us like to wear it or style it in a certain way. You know, it can be super baggy, it could be tight, it can be cropped. We have access to the white shirt and we can style it. Women to non-binary people to men too. So the issue, generally speaking, is not how we wear the T-shirt. You can present in any way. Nobody likes to hear that you're wearing the T-shirt you style wrong. You wear it the way you want, right? So I also am very respectful of how people construct their identity, and I always want to make sure that we reassure them that the way you present is perfectly fine. That's your T-shirt. You wear it the way you want. However, we also have to understand that the T-shirt is not an abstract thing. It's very much connected. This particular T-shirt, this masculinity, is connected to a bigger system that rewards or punishes or provides privilege along gender lines. And it's a patriarchal society, a patriarchal community, a patriarchal system. And within that, if you are a man and if you wear the right white shirt in a certain way, right, then that gives you privilege. That gives you, a number of things that give you power over others, or the right to dominate, or the right not to act when we see things, or the right to be the right to not care, or leave things with impunity. That is basically, what happens in a patriarchal society. So I think that masculinity in itself can be healthy, can be unhealthy, can be many things. But the problem is that it has this relationship with this system, with this machine. And this machine comes biting, right? It's violent, it generates violence. So it's not so much how we present the shirt, but what happens with that shirt in this context of this, you know, very violent system that we have. And I think that helps, because the last thing I would want in a class is for anyone to feel uncomfortable about the way they're presenting any identity. This is who we are, right? I style my t-shirt this way. This is me, right? So I never, whatever it is, you know, because, you know, we cannot judge on the base of that. And we have to make sure that everyone is included, and, you know, all white t-shirts, no matter how you style them, welcome. But also there has to be a conversation on what that entails, and how that, yeah, works in the context of an unequal society. Thanks.
Well, and I think going back to your question and thinking about what was just said about there is, we can get into like who benefits, who loses. There is privilege, and I just want to be real clear about that, right? When there's some folks don't have to worry about when they walk to their cars or whatnot. But I guess the question I will always go back to, and particularly for men, at what cost do you get that privilege, right? Because we all then suffer. Literally every person suffers, right? So I think about, like, I'm getting real personal today, but anyway, I just think about like my relationship to my dad. My dad died a year and a half ago ish. Like, I've been on this earth for, I think I'm 35 years, right? And 35 years of having a relationship with my dad, he told me, "I love you" one time. What's the cost, right? What does that mean about your affection or appreciation to just the people that you interact with? Like, what's the cost, right? So I do think we have to recognize that there is privilege in all of it. And then also who gets the privilege is also a continuum. How Vern receives privilege and how I get privilege, those are also two different things, right? How we all get privilege as being academics is very different than folks who don't have it, right? Like, there's privilege in all that. But I still think all of it comes back to this point about, in the system that we live in and we understand masculinity, are we willing to continue to take the cost of it? And that cost sometimes is economics. I think about, like, for my, like, if you're in a relationship, in particular if you're in a heterosexual relationship, and your partner is not making as much money as you make, or a same person in her position, in my head, I'm like, we missing out on coins. Like, that's vacations. There's more money that can be going to food. That could be money going to savings. Like, this is personal now, right? And when we think about our responsibility to creating a better system, I think, again, men will have to ask themselves, if your mama came home, your sister, your partner came home and said, "I learned that Joe Blow over here, who's a man, is making more money than I do. We got everything is equal. If you ain't got no questions about that, I don't know." And I guess for me, are we all willing to continue to take the cost that comes with it? And then there are more detrimental costs, right? There are people who die because of this. Yeah. One of the most violent days in America is Sundays. Why? Your favorite team lose their football game. Who does that then get taken out on? There's a cost to this, right? So I think, for me, I think it's in this system for all of us. Are we willing to continue to take these costs? Because they cost a lot, not just in physical money. Like, emotions, relationships, potential new opportunities. There's just so much that we lose,
Yeah.
even in the privilege, right? Like that privilege comes with a cost, and we don't talk about that side of it, of what it could mean for us. But
The only other piece that I would kind of highlight in this part of the conversation is just to make the point that, you know, it's easy to write off that, you know, crying on an airplane, you know, that's a pretty innocuous, right? Like all of those narratives, all of those scripts that we're taught are the things that feed our patriarchal sexist system. And so this question about like, well, what do you say about kind of the privilege aspect of that is, in order to address those systems, there are a lot of things that we need to do to work on that system. And some of that involves unpacking these really minute, seemingly like almost insidious scripts, right? Boys will be boys. You were talking about the playground. Like, if we're not addressing it there, those are the scripts that feed this system. So if we can't change it there, and yes, we need to be addressing equal pay and like all of these pieces are super important. And we need to acknowledge that these scripts are what feed
Yeah.
the system.
Yeah, I heard someone explain it once that, you know, it's not that masculinity is the only problem out there, right? Or the only thing that is driving the way our society works, but masculinity is a component of basically any social justice or political issue, right? So when you think about masculinity in the sense of power and control, domination, violence, like you think about our foreign policy, our economic policy of who gets what, it's competing against each other. You think about gun violence, you think about police violence, you think about, like, you could go on, and masculinity is going to have some part, or the elements of masculinity are behind that system that we've been talking about. I want to go back to, because I think this is a really important thing that Marlon started to touch on, of like elements of privilege and how that is distributed. So how do you think masculinity is constructed differently depending on your other identities? So whether that's race, ability, class, etc.
well, it impacts all of it. I mean, again, Vern, I was talking about this beforehand, but I think about like when I was growing up in Mississippi, like there were the kind of very stereotypical things about what it meant to be a man. Like, oh, you gonna play football, you know, you gonna be strong. On Saturdays, you're gonna get out there and mow that lawn, you know, like there were all those things. But there were also the elements of like other gender roles, right? That we were responsible for. Everybody in my house learned how to cook. Like my mother was like, you're gonna be able to clean and be able to cook for yourself. Like those are things that I was told that I need to learn how to do, right? Now, in some other folks' house, they may not have learned how to wash. Some men may not have learned how to wash their clothes. I know some men who don't still know how to wash their clothes, but that's beside the point. But I do think it starts to get complicated. There's more nuance and complication as you start to add more identities to like the fray, right? So even as like people who have doctorates, right? Like there's a certain gravitas when people are like, oh, Dr. Blake, you know, you're like, yeah, get it right. You know, like that, like there's a certain ego that comes with that, right? And so once you start adding money into it, masculinity starts to, and then you start to understand there's like this kind of continuum of it, right? There are some things that are pretty particular, the same on every group, but all of a sudden it starts to get a little different as you start to add other nuances to it. And so I think that also complicates it. And I'm not necessarily saying it makes the system bigger, but I do think that all of a sudden, like it becomes more complicated in our understanding of it. Because again, there's this old saying that says, no matter how big and bad you are, If a 2-year-old hands you a fake phone, you will always say hello, right? Like a little kid be like, hello, you can be like, hello. You know this fake. It don't matter who you are, what you come with, like that can be broken down real quick, right? That Vern that we family. Vern got a little one now. Vern is a little different, right? How he shows up, how he presents when you have a child. Like all of a sudden things start to get iffy based on your life experience. You know, I got a beautiful partner in my life, and there are some things that I was particular about 10 years ago. There have been some reflection about what that means in our relationship, right? So I definitely think life experience, nuance, all those things change how all of these scripts kind of look. I do think there's some consistencies there, but they shift and change over time too.
I love that example of the toy phone because to me it shows a way to kind of even just for a moment like get past all those scripts and the socialization of like, okay, I can't be too vulnerable playing with, but it's like little kid, yeah, that's yeah.
So the question is the cost of it.
And thinking about how masculinity is constructed differently depending on various other identities.
Yes, definitely. Different identities will affect how you interact with different constructions of masculinity, how you reproduce them, which is many times the way that women participate, in this process. It can also be in many ways. We already discussed race, educational level, class, of course, and many other dimensions that can make you more vulnerable to injustice in a society. I mean, we have here Professor Zimmerman, who's teaching a course on migration and gender, and how the migrant status also intersects with your gender construction. And so there are many ways in which we can look at this and look at that, and how gender intersects with so many other topics. I think, Seth, you said something so important, like it's not the most important issue, but if you look at all the issues, you will find that, questioning gender brings you some interesting reflections on where we should be going if we are interested in social justice. So, yeah. I appreciate that.
Vern, do you have anything to add? So as we're thinking about, right, we touched a little bit on this question of is healthy masculinity an oxymoron? What about this term called feminism? Is that for men as well? Are men like, is there a place for men in feminism? Who wants to start with that one?
I appreciated this question, and I immediately thought of the late bell hooks. And so I had to pull a little quote. So what I'd like to do is read a quote, and maybe we can react to that. So if you haven't read anything by bell hooks, I would encourage you to read bell hooks. Wrote a book called Feminism is for Everyone, and writes, simply put, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. This was the definition of feminism I offered in Feminist Theory from Margin to Center more than 10 years ago, and she wrote this book a while ago too, right? But it was my hope at the time that this would become a common definition everyone would use. I like this definition because it did not imply that men were the enemy. By naming sexism as the problem, it went directly to the heart of the matter. Practically, it is a definition which implies that all sexist thinking and action is the problem, whether those who perpetuate it are female or male, child or adult. It is also broad enough to include an understanding of systemic, institutionalized sexism, a definition as a definition, is open-ended. To understand feminism, it implies one has to necessarily understand sexism.
Unpack that quote for us a little bit, Frank.
I would
Or
invite
somebody
our
else.
panel to, but
Yes. Okay. I think that there is, of course, a place for men to be feminist, as long as it's not performative or for clout, appropriating the label. But what I also like about some of what is going on, in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, which are the groups I'm currently researching, these are groups of men, collectives, of men that are trying to find a way to find a language to really push against these constructions, and more particularly and specifically patriarchal mandates that have been imposed, and from which they get privilege, and they understand that too. And I think that what is interesting is that they don't want to be called feminist groups. They don't want to be called feminist men. They are choosing the word anti-patriarchal collectives of men. And in Spanish, we have the word hombre for man, and that it signals like a historically constructed, like universal, like the rights of men in that way, universal. But we also have another word, which is varones, which is specifically men, varones and mujeres, right? So they also claim that identity to really cut that idea that their experience is universal, which is a violent approach, right, to identity. So they are colectivo, right, de varones antipatriarcales. And I think that is very powerful to me when I see it, and I am following what they're doing, their activities, their workshops, the manifestos they put out, the communications. We have interviewed several of them, and one even was part of our class, Making and Unmaking Masculinities, some years ago. It's very interesting what they're doing, and I think there is definitely a place for them, a very important political aspect to their work as well. Very much so. There is another group that I'm following in Uruguay that is called Daddy's Traders, which I love their name, and they're really active politically as well. So there are people that are trying to organize around this idea of, no, this mandate, this patriarchal mandate is violent, we resist it, we want to undo it, we want to unlearn it, we want to push. And I respect that a lot.
Yeah, and I think you bringing up all these organizations and even some of the literature, right? It's a reminder that none of this is new, right? Like there have been men working against sexist oppression for decades, and there's an ocean of stuff if you're interested to go out and explore and join other people and read. Marlon, did you want to?
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing about our, in particular for men, our responsibility in this whole feminist movement, and thinking about the definition that Vern read, like our responsibility in ending sexist, patriarchal, like societies or structures will have like a profound impact on like our society. And men, as the people who often, carry out this system, we have a major responsibility in ending that whole thing. And so I think about the example of like in STEM, right? In my job, there are folks who identify as women who like tell me some stories about some things they've heard. And I think this is where my mind goes first after like, damn, I'm sorry you experienced that, number one. But number two, I think about like, what about that person is like the next, who's going to find the cure for whatever? Now they're gone. They're out of that system because somebody decided they want to be sexist, and they're like, I'm out. And it happens in all these spheres. And sometimes it could be other women who say those things to them. You're not strong enough to be in here. Like, oh, dang, for real, right? Like, it's not just men who are doing this, going back to the definition. There are also women who then help men carry out that same thing, right? And so I think for me, men have an important responsibility in that, not just because we like carry out most of that system, but we also will probably even benefit more if everyone is included in the system, because we all benefit when we all do well, right? So I think about all the folks whose dreams are shattered, like completely shattered, because they were told they were not strong enough to play a sport, or you were not cut out to, be in whatever. Pick a thing. It doesn't really matter, right? So for me, I just think about all those shattered dreams and what we as a society then miss out on, because this system just recreates this thing, and all of a sudden we all suffer. And again, I would just ask, are we willing to keep carrying the cost of that?
Yeah.
Because again, there could be millions of folks who could have helped us get a lot further. I mean, it's clear. I mean, we had a woman president, and we've been in a lot of messes. Pretty sure this could be cleaned up. I mean, like, we got to start asking ourselves those questions, right? And why? Like, I mean, even if you think about the election, right? Some of the things that you hear about what people said about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Biden or whoever, like, you got to, like, what did they say, and what is it rooted in?
Yeah.
Right? And I think those are the contexts we really have to start to really unpack what all this means. But the last thing quickly I'll say, I think part about that quote that's like very clear to me, we don't need an enemy. Like, you don't need an enemy. Like, let's get down to what it means right here. This is about sexist, oppressive behavior, and it don't matter who doing it. Like, that needs to be eradicated, right? Or at least reduced to a way to where, I don't know if you can completely eradicate it in our small instance, but I'm just saying we got big reductions in it. I really do believe that part. But I do think we don't need an enemy in it.
Right. And
It's
I think
everywhere.
to your point, like having an enemy is a lot different than holding people accountable who are putting forth
The behavior.
furthering.
Yeah,
Right.
that thing.
So looking at the clock, last call if you have any questions, write on your note card, and then if you could start just passing the note cards to the aisle. Aaron, who's one of our peer health educators, is going to come around and collect your note cards. So if you could pass them to the aisle so Aaron can grab them, and then she'll bring them up to me. While they're working on that, I have one more question for the panelists. So my last question for the panelists before we get to audience questions. What about a St. Thomas student? How does this whole conversation relate to students here? What are some things that you would like students to learn? How can they take what we've been talking about and apply it to their lives at the university? What do y'all think about that?
I mean, I know there's a larger definition to this, but just in our common understanding, all for the common good, the pursuit for truth and understanding, and most importantly, number one, the dignity of all human beings. Like, I think our values at St. Thomas, like, really encourage us and lead us to really thinking about what are the lives we want to live and how do we support other people in living their own lives, like, authentically about who they are as individuals, right? And so I think for me, these conversations are important because this is what St. Thomas is asking you to really reflect on and to really think about, especially like in our like kind of foundation of our Catholic identity, right? But again, when it's all said and done, y'all gonna be leaders somewhere. It could just be in your household. It can be in an organization. It can be somewhere. You're gonna be leading somewhere. And so when you encounter another person who is different from you, who performs gender differently, performs masculinity different. Like I have a friend of mine who is gay, and we have these stereotypes of people who are gay. They're feminine. They have we have all these stereotypes, but I guarantee you, he doesn't fit none of those, right? Like, what happens when you encounter a person who doesn't fit that script? And so, I think for me, it's just one of those things we have to really be clear about. Like, and I think again, as future leaders, like, what happens when not if, when you encounter somebody who's different from you? Like, what do you do with that? And I think being clear about who we are and what that means to us, because again, there's a cost if when that person's dignity isn't like fulfilled. So
To piggyback on that a little bit, and I don't know that this is necessarily specific to St. Thomas students, but I guess my hope in terms of a takeaway from this, you're kind of talk about like lessons learned. My hope is that you'll continue to be curious. You'll continue to ask yourself questions about the ways in which gender shows up in your life and start to begin to notice those things and ask yourself questions like, is this actually authentic to me, or is this part of this script, this narrative, this bill of goods that I've been sold, and am I buying it? And some of those things, maybe the answer is yes, that's part of who you are. And maybe some of those things are things we need to let go of so that we can improve the conditions that we've been talking about all night.
All right, so we're going to get to some audience questions. And we've only got about 20 minutes left. And we've got a bunch of questions. So it's on the panelists, short and sweet, to the point. No promises we get to every audience question. But we got a couple that are around what even is the definition of healthy masculinity? How is that different than unhealthy masculinity? And also a question about how violence might be connected to masculinity, which I think might fall into one of those categories. So, what is healthy masculinity?
Can I?
Please.
Because you said short and sweet. Healthy masculinity does not hurt and doesn't hurt others. That's the simplest definition, I think. And violence comes into play because violence is the tool of domination, is the tool by which you make others comply. And I think that's how it enters this conversation. And at the end of the day, if we look at the people that run our businesses, our government, and et cetera, we can see that deploying violence has worked very well to support a patriarchal structure. Even in a democracy, even in the oldest democracy in the world. So, yeah.
Anyone else want to chime in? What is healthy masculinity?
The one thing I want to piggyback on is this concept of violence, because I think that when I immediately think about violence, I think about physical violence, and there are very much ways in which violence shows up psychologically, and ways in which men are actually harmed by that kind of violence, i.e., being emotionally restrictive. Like the only emotions I'm allowed to express based on these scripts are anger and anger, right? So that's violence.
Yeah.
Right there. So I think sometimes we can jump to like physical violence, and it just shows up in a variety of different ways. So thanks I like that definition.
Yeah, and I think too, and the idea of healthy, right, in my mind is like, are you physically and mentally like good?
Okay.
So I think for me, when I think about healthy masculinity, I think for me, for people who are contemplating this idea, it's not even just about masculinity. It could be about femininity. What pick a identity. Are you cool at that? Are you cool with it? Are you physically well? Are you spiritually well? And more importantly, are you conscious about who told you what it should or should not be, right? And I'm not, that isn't to say that like being strong and all that is healthy, but I'm just saying, I think for me, it's more about the fact of like, well, like healthy is really around your physical, spiritual, mental like capacity. And
Yeah.
so like, there's that piece of it.
Yeah,
you
we
know?
like to talk about the dimensions of well-being,
Yes.
and it goes back to that, right? There's all these physical, emotional, spiritual, etc. The other thing that I'll just mention really quick, the reason why I asked that question around is healthy masculinity an oxymoron, is because we often do an activity, and you may have heard before the idea of like the man box, right? Which is this box of all the characteristics that men are traditionally supposed to be, right? So we're supposed to be strong and tough, and only emotion we have is anger, and we don't cry, and we hook up with lots of girls, and we're good at sports, and we make a lot of money, and we drive fast cars, whatever, right? And so if you take away the restriction of that, if you stop telling people that's the only thing you can be, if you erase the lines around the box, and you take away the elements of those that are violent, that are harmful, like you said, Paula, what is left? And some people would say, well, what is left is a healthier version of masculinity. It's the idea that you can still be strong and you can still like sports, but that's not the only thing you can be, right? And some people would argue that, well, what's left, that's not even masculinity anymore because you've taken away the core part of the definition, right? So some of that is just kind of splitting hairs linguistically, but I think that's the idea is how do we take away the societal pressures and find something that feels more authentic and that doesn't cause harm to other people. Marlon mentioned this a little bit, but I want to bring up again. Do you think sexuality has anything to do with how people see masculinity? Why or why not?
Yes.
Great.
No, I
Anyone
mean,
else?
yeah, well, it is true. I think it's just like when we think about like our sexuality and how that is expressed, like it looks different. Like I think about like how we stereotypically think about folks who are lesbian, right? Like they kind of express what some folks would be like, those are masculine like masculine things, right? Like, and again, it goes back to what you just raised, and I think earlier about like, well, are those things really masculine or not? Are they just traits that all of us have? Like, probably, but I do, but how we express or perform our sexuality, I do think influences how we show up in different spaces, time, etc. But I think simply, yes, I think sexuality does influence our gender, or even how we even I can't think of another word, police other people.
Yeah.
Like there's also that piece of it too.
Yeah.
Like where you also then like put that onto other folks when they are not out of the norm
Sure.
or whatever.
I, in my opinion, they do not connect. These are two different realms. And of course, there is the social construction, like you said, the stereotypes, the biases, but these do not connect, do not influence each other, like at the basis of it. You can have any identity, and your sexuality can be very different in each case.
Right.
And I think that that is the beauty of looking at our humanity beyond those constructions, that we are complex, that we're nuanced, that things change, that we connect with other humans in so many beautiful ways. And I think that I want to emphasize, especially for my students.
So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's two separate identities, right? There's gender and sexuality, and there's all sorts of different combinations and permutations. And just because you're in one category is not going to influence where you're at in the other category. But we know that socially, and when we're interacting with the world, right? If we're part of one gender category, people might have expectations about what our sexuality is,
Yeah.
and the way that you walk in the world, depending on what your sexuality is and your gender, right, impacts the way the way you experience your life, right?
Yeah, and even the way you are perceived, or even I mean, this is a whole week in my class on masculinities. We talk about female masculinity,
Yeah.
right? And I think this is a good case to see what happens when you take men out of masculinity. What happens? What's left, right? The performance of that gender when it's women, and then how sexuality can be very much, very diverse in that context as well. And maybe as a society, it's easier for us to look at those examples and be able to open that. It's just the insistence um, of our society to bring together men and masculinity constantly that kind of makes it invisible for all the ways in which women perform masculinity as well. And that, I think, clouds this connection between sexuality and gender. And it's an interesting example, an interesting exercise to see all the ways in which women do perform masculinity and how they're like, oh, I wish we could see that. And it's right there, and it's like a blind spot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got a couple more that are similar questions. So one is, are all cultural standards for gender wrong? If not, which ones are okay and why? Another similar question is the existence of masculine norms what's problematic? Or is it just certain ones that as a culture are problematic? So when I think about that question, I think back
We ain't
to
got
the
that much time, bro.
here I go answering my own questions. I think back to the man box, and it's like, okay, are all those qualities in the man box bad? Should we not have anything? Or do we just get rid of the unhealthy ones? Do we get rid of the edges of the box so there's no expectations based on, your assigned gender at birth? What do y'all think?
Well, I just don't know if I don't know if it can be just so dichotomous that it's good or bad. Sometimes anger is healthy. Like that can be a healthy expression of an emotion, right? I guess for me, where it gets problematic is about if you express anger because you have no other way to express your emotion, then I think it can become problematic. That when I get, when someone frustrates me, the only thing I know how to do is hit another person. Ooh, like I think we can say that's not. But again, it's not. I don't know if it's good or bad in like on this like foundational piece. But I guess the question for me is about, well, why when it gets expressed in a certain manner, then I think it can become problematic. For me, I just think for all of us, it's about how can we live our authentic selves and not have other people to tell us that it's wrong or right. Like if you're a good leader and you good at what you do, it don't really matter what your gender is. Like you're just good at it. But again, we often have to um, put these like oh she's a good woman leader or that's a good male leader. Like we always got to qualify with something else, and I think that's when things can get problematic when you start to qualify. They get expressed in these certain ways because of something else. But on their the foundations of them, I don't know if it's good or bad. I just think about how they get expressed, and that is often where it can become problematic. That's a very terrible way of saying that.
My real quick response, piggybacking off that a little bit, is I think what's problematic is the expectations that become limitations of folks expressing their full humanity. So I'll leave it at that.
No, I agree with that, and also to reiterate, like the expression is never problematic in itself. It's the context of inequality, racial, and sexism and heteronormativity and so forth that makes it, toxic, as people like to call it in the media.
Speaking of those systems, has sexism gotten better or worse over the years? Another yes or no binary question, right? So maybe that answer is both.
No. It hasn't gotten better, I think. I think that we still have a lot of work to do, and what gives me hope is that this generation, the younger generation, and the kids that are in high school, they so get it, and they find it intolerable. And I love that about this generation. They find it, the constraints of those constructions are intolerable for many, many of them. And that gives me hope. But right now, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I would say quickly too, I think on that hope piece is that we can't get blinded or distracted by all of the the negativity that we see. We get bombarded with that. But there are also aspects in our society where we do see those hopes, right? Like when we see like in a couple weeks in Minnesota, the Crown Act, right? That you can't be fired because your hair looks a certain way for whoever it is. That's just not about, I think it's kind of put towards black women, but that's like everyone gets to benefit from that, right? There are these glimpses of it. We see it in our society where like it shows up. It's just, can we get enough of those wins to start to create a new system? But unfortunately, it ain't really got a lot better because, you know, for whatever, well, I know why, but
Yeah. What actions, Vern, this may be for you, what actions perpetuate masculinity for male infants even before they're born?
The way in which the parents are socialized, like the question I would ask is, who were you before your parents were born? Because the way in which we're socialized, that reifies a particular system, and that socialization continues to perpetuate, right? So, I mean, I guess like we ain't got time to list them all,
Yeah.
but the way I would answer that is to think about, like, when you think about how could you be socialized before you were born, well, think about all of the influences that you're going to encounter once you are born. That's all part of that socialization.
I remember
So that's what I meant by it.
my sister had a child, and before she was born, right, my mom was knitting a blanket, and it was pink. And my mom says something about, oh, well, if she ends up having a girl, I could give this to her. And I'm like, Mom, you could give it to the child regardless, right? And so, I mean, it's about, yeah, that legacy and the family and expectations. And yeah. Is chivalry in a relationship important? And does it help or hurt the idea of gender roles?
I mean, what are we really talking about here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I love it. I love it when my partner opens the door for me and, brings me flowers and does all these sweet things for me. We've been together for almost 10 years and I love it. I mean, that is not dead at all. And I also try to put a lot of thought and care into our relationship. And that is kind of part of what makes, a relationship sweet. I don't think it's dead. I think that sometimes when people bring that up is because there is a little concept that only one person can do that and the other person cannot. And then there are some gender stereotypes that start to build in, and then that becomes a little bit more problematic. But of course, I'm as feminist as I can every day, and I absolutely love those gestures of care and tenderness. And I hope that I can also provide those every single day to my family in general. So yeah, lovely.
and I think what's important about that is like, can you have an open conversation with your partner about what that means? If I went to open the door for my partner, she would be like, "What is you doing?" Like she doesn't want me to open the door, right? Like that's not what she wants. I've had other partners who's like, "Oh, they appreciate it when you open the door," right?
Well,
So
but if I open the door for my husband, he's okay too. Like
Right,
we
yeah,
try to
yeah.
be
Yeah.
as courteous and as sweet and tender to each other as we can, because
Yeah.
if not, what's the point?
yeah, so I think part of it has to do with like like actually having thoughtful conversations with people you're in relationship with, not just like your partner. I mean, like your good friend or like whoever, like to be thoughtful about that, to say, hey, this is how I express my appreciation. Is that cool? Like, are some people like, oh no, I'm cool with that, whatever. So I think it's also about like, are we willing to have open conversations, or like when my partner does open the door for me, I'm not like, well, what are you doing? Like it's just love. Like, and how do we express that for other people? And I think a lot of our frustrations in our relationships come from just a lack of communication, because we have miscommunication about what those signals may mean to other people. Like I grew up in Mississippi. You open the door for everybody.
Yeah.
Like that's what it is. Like,
Right.
or when I say yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, no sir, people are like, oh my God. To me, it's just respect. But I can also respect people who don't want to be called it. I'm cool with that, right? But I do think a lot of it just comes from miscommunication about signals, because we all are raised and live our lives differently. So
But it could also be that sometimes that chivalry is, there is an expectation of what is going to be received for those gestures. Are you going to receive the label of being the nice guy, as opposed to
Yeah.
the bad ones? What are we really trying to capture here? I think that holding the door and being courteous to everyone, no matter what their gender identity is awesome.
Yeah.
And we should all be taking great care of each other in any community. Yeah.
Makes me think about I used to have that kind of misconception of, oh, a feminist is somebody who's going to get mad at me if I open the door for them, right? But when you go back to the definition of feminism that Vern shared, like from Bell Hooks, how does being nice and tender and loving towards somebody like contribute to sexist oppression? It's quite the opposite, right? So as long as it's both people, it's everybody, it's like that's not right. That's not the thing that we're trying to avoid. It's really the thing that we want to be doing is
Yeah. So it's to find a love that is liberating
right.
and not constrained, and even more, more of that patriarchal mandate into even the interpersonal relationships that you have. Find liberation in that tenderness.
So we have one more question, and it's kind of a full circle because I think we started out talking about crying in public, right? So last question was, why does society say it's okay for men to cry, but then men who cry are treated differently? And I think it also speaks, maybe you can give us an uplifting message of, okay, this is part of like the societal change that we need to create.
Oh, wait a minute.
You go
With
first.
the crying with masculinities is one of a topic that we also look in our class. Men cry a lot. The patriarchal mandate gives them times where it's okay to cry. There are some politicians that have played this to perfection, crying in a specific moment. In epic poems, we can see the hero crying before battle because is in pain, thinking that they may lose, right, a brother in battle. They cry, and that is seen as a strength, as a way of expressing their masculinity. What is not okay in this context is to cry during battle, let's say. So there is a time and a place for crying within the patriarchal structure. So I think that when the crying is out of place, it really is like a glitch in the machine. And that's why many times it's seen as something that needs to be corrected, fixed. And that, I think, that is part of the problem. Yeah, men, like, let's say they won the championship, they get the cup, they cry. That is not seen as a problem. So it's when they cry, how they cry, what is that moment of crying.
All that.
Great.
yeah.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
we're
And
go ahead.
just real quick,
Finish
and
it
I
off
also
for us.
think too is that going, I think to your point about the liberation, like what is the liberation for all of us when we're just free to do it, and there are no constraints on that time or place, right? That we get to have a free expression about what that means, right? Like I know like if when I because Vern and I've known Vern a long time, right? But when I say I love you, Vern, like there's just so much liberation with just sharing affection for another human being. Vern just so happens to be a male, right?
Yeah.
I love you too, son. I love
Love
you
you.
too. I love everybody. I love all of you, actually, right? Right. So I'll end with this quote that I always think about. And it says, peace can only be achieved when meeting a complete stranger, you're automatically invested in their happiness. And I'm all like every person I run into, I just want you to be the best liberated you can be.
Well, that is
Right.
a beautiful way to conclude. Thank you, Marlon. Um, okay, so thanks for hanging 2 more minutes. I'm just going to show you. Got a couple things here on the slide to talk through. I want to let you know about some events we've got coming up. So you're here for the Man Enough panel. This is part of a monthly series that we do. So we've got another event coming up in April where we're going to dive even deeper into this idea of moving toward healthy masculinity. So check that out, April 17th. We also have a healthy relationship workshop. We do those once a month as well. So that'll be April 12th. And I also just wanted to let everybody know there's ongoing opportunity for professors out there, student organizations, everybody. You can always bring us in from the Center for Wellbeing to have one of these kind of conversations, whether it's about healthy relationships, bystander intervention, violence prevention, masculinity. This is our webpage where you can click request a presentation. So you can find that within the Center for Wellbeing page on 1 St. Thomas. A couple quick reminders. We've got cookies outside. Hopefully they arrived. And you can scan your event passes at the tablecloth. And one other thing to look out for, you'll get an email. All you students will get an email in the next few days or weeks from the Title IX office, they're doing a campus climate survey, which help us get information about the campus climate around sexual violence and sexual misconduct. So I want to encourage all of you to fill that out when you get that in your email. So thanks so much for being here. Can we thank our panelists again for being here? Excellent job. And we will see you at our next event.